guys, so I'm here today to do my March reading wrap up. I actually read quite a few books in March, so I will waste no more time before I talk to you about those books. First is a book that I've already done a full review of, so if you want to hear a little bit more about what I thought about it, then I'll link it down below for you, but that is The Grace Keepers by Kirsty Logan. This is a fantasy novel set in a world that is almost entirely made up of sea. There's very little land left, and people either live on these tiny areas of land or live on boats. Generally speaking, those are the two options anyway, and it follows two main characters. One is North, who lives on a circus boat and performs on the circus boat with her bear, and the other character is Callanish, who is a gracekeeper, which is someone who conducts the kind of funerary rites of the people that live at sea. So she kind of lives on a constructed land platform at sea, so she's permanently in the same place, but it's not real land. And it follows these two characters separately and apart, how their lives intertwine. There's not a lot of outright magic in this book, so I guess it's more of a low fantasy, but it has a very fairy tale, folklore-esque feeling throughout the story, and it is absolutely magnificent, so beautifully written, such a beautiful world, some really interesting characters, and I would really recommend it. I think worth the hype, this one. The next book I have to talk to you about here is the third in a series, and that is Terry Pratchett's Raising Steam. This is the third in his series set in the Discworld, which follows the character Moist von Lipwig, the first being Going Postal. You may have heard me say this before, but Going Postal is one of my favourite books of all time, not just from the Discworld, just generally just one of the best books I've ever read. I love it. I've reread it loads of times. I've also reread the sequel quite a few times, which is Making Money, but this is the first time I actually managed to read Raising Steam. I tried once before and got a little bit bored, so never finished it, but this time I managed to finally finish it. Unfortunately, my initial reaction to it kind of still stands. This book was a letdown for the Discworld. I don't think it was a terrible book. I didn't find it really displeasurable to read. There were still some fun jokes in there. It was interesting to catch up on some of the characters. However, a lot of the characterization in this book seemed really off to me. It didn't seem like the characters I knew and loved, especially for like Adorabelle and the veterinary were a bit weird. And all in all, just a bit of a disappointment. Probably one of my least favourite Discworld books so far. The thing is though, you're not going to read this unless you've read the other two, Going Postal and Making Money, so it's really up to yourself whether you want to bother. Most of us, if we're Discworld fans, want to read all of the books, so it's definitely not a waste of time, but I can't pretend I loved it. Oh, and I didn't say, but it's about the invention of the first railway. Next is a sequel I was more impressed with though, however, and that is Shadow Scale by Rachel Hartman, which is a sequel to Seraphina. This is a high fantasy series with dragons, if you couldn't guess by the picture on the front. If you know me, you know I love dragons. Like, they're some of my favourite magical creatures. They're just phenomenal. Rachel Hartman's books contain a really interesting idea of dragons. In this series, the dragons and humans have been kind of on and off again at war for a very long time. There is currently a peace between most of the humans and the dragons, but if the dragons want to coexist and live amongst the humans and kind of interact with them in their kind of like courts and their politics and, you know, make deals with them, they have to live their lives as humans, so they can transform into humans, but so they look like humans but they're dragons, and they can turn back into their dragon selves, but they're not supposed to. Our main character Seraphina is a court musician, and she kind of bridges a gap between dragons and humans communication wise, and it's about her role in the kind of court intrigue and the greater events that go on between the humans and the dragons and their relationship and that kind of thing. This is obviously a sequel, so I don't want to say too much about what happens in this because it would spoil the first book. I plan on doing a review of both books together, however, because it is only a two-part series. This was the finale of the series. I quite like that it was a two-part series. You don't get a lot of two-part series in fantasy, I don't think. So I enjoyed that about it, but I'll do a review of both of them together, and I'll have a non-spoiler and a spoiler section if you're interested. I really enjoyed this. It wasn't as slow to start as Seraphina was, and I was generally really pleased with how things worked out, so definitely worth picking up if you enjoyed Seraphina. Next up is a collection of short stories, and that is There Once Lived a Girl Who Seduced Her Sister's Husband and He Hanged Himself Love Stories by Ludmila Petruskaya. This is my second collection of short stories by this author. They are translated from the original Russian and these are published in Penguin Modern Classics editions. I did not enjoy this as much as the last one. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I still think it was an enjoyable read. I think maybe it would have impressed me more if I hadn't read her other collection, which were Scary Fairy Tales, because those contained a lot of elements of magic realism, as you'd expect from kind of fairy tale-esque stories, which I think made them a little bit less predictable and created a little bit more variety in there. This is a slightly shorter collection, and I think that's because the themes and the ideas, and they're very dark stories in here, are really interesting and really fun to read, but it gets quite repetitive, I found. There wasn't enough variety in there and enough surprises in comparison to the previous collection, so I was a little bit disappointed given that, but I didn't think it was a bad collection and I still absolutely adore the author. I think her writing style is really interesting. It's really straightforward and quite blunt and I enjoy that, and I'd still highly recommend her other collection. And it's not that I wouldn't recommend this, but it wasn't grabbing me the way the other one was. I wasn't like constantly desperate to pick it back up and read another story. But next is a book that impressed me far more, and that is a collection of poetry which I actually mentioned in my monthly favourites, and that is When I Grow Up I Want to Be Mary Beard by Megan Beach. This is a collection of feminist, social justice, poetry. There is a bit of a variety in here. There's a few more personal poems in here, like dealt a bit with like relationships and stuff like that. Those aren't my favourite, but I think that's something to do with my taste in poetry. I like either poetry that kind of deals with big political themes or overarching kind of social issues, or I quite like funny poetry. I'm not quite as interested in poetry that deals with like love and relationships and stuff like that, but the poems are still good. They just didn't capture me as much as the other ones. The other poems in here are some of my absolutely new favourite poems. There's just some fantastic poems in here, like honestly, new favourite poems. We'll be rereading this book very soon. The first poem is definitely one of my favourites. When I Grow Up I Want to Be Mary Beard. You know how much I love Mary Beard. She is a phenomenal woman, and one of the themes that stood out to me in this book was kind of women in the media and how women are treated online, sexism online, the perception of women online, and that really struck a chord with me. It meant a lot to me. I really identified with the author. I think she just expresses things so eloquently, and her poetry is really accessible but still really clever and beautiful, and she has quite an irregular rhyming scheme which I really enjoy. There's just a lovely rhythm to her poetry, and I would just all in all highly recommend this collection. It's so short. If you're not really into poetry or not sure where to start with poetry, I think this would be a great book to pick up because it is really readable but also a really great example of some fantastic poetry. So highly recommend, love this book. I then read 2 ancient Greek tragedies this month. The first was The Trojan Women from This Bind Up, translated by Paul Roche. This has 10 Euripides plays in it. I'm slowly making my way through all of Euripides' plays. The Trojan Women, however, is possibly my new favourite Euripides play. I've read over half of his plays now, and The Trojan Women, maybe of all the Greek tragedies I've read, was probably the most visceral and emotional and emotive Greek tragedy I've ever read. I think the thing about Greek tragedy that's unfortunate is that usually we only have one surviving, whereas they would have been performed in 3s, so you don't get a complete story arc, and I think that takes away from some of the experience. However, The Trojan Women, despite not having its 2 companion plays, still conjured up a lot of emotion for me. It dealt with the experience of the women after the Trojan War and then kind of being distributed amongst the men. These are the women on the losing side of the war, the Trojan side, and their treatment, and it's just really, like I said, really emotive and a really fascinating play. Would highly recommend reading that one. The next play I read didn't blow me away quite as much, but it was enjoyable, and that was Heracles from this collection, translated by Robin Waterfield. This is a incident in Heracles' life in which he murders his wife and children because he has a spell cast over him. Next is a novel, and that is The Book Collector by Alice Thompson. This is a book that unfortunately for me suffered from overhype. I enjoyed this book, but I was expecting greatness from this book, and it did let me down. I went in, I think, with too high expectations for this book that it unfortunately just didn't live up to. However, I don't think it's a bad book. at all. I think it's a good book. I enjoyed reading it. I found it a very fast-paced read. It's about a woman who gets married who doesn't really know her husband that well. She thinks they share a love of reading, but he actually is more obsessed with owning the physical object of books rather than actually reading books. As time passes, their marriage really isn't turning out to be what she thought it was, and she becomes quite paranoid. And I think also partially what she seems to be going through is kind of postpartum depression after she has a child, and her husband ends up institutionalizing her for hysteria in a women's asylum. I really like that theme. I really enjoy books that deal with the treatment of women's mental health in the kind of 1800s, early 1900s. I found it very fascinating. The treatment of women's hysteria is very cruel, so that was quite dark, and there's a lot of allusions to quite dark fairy tales in this story. So a lot of really great things together in a book. Unfortunately, what disappointed me was somewhat the pacing. I think because it was so fast-paced, it didn't create a kind of real sense of suspense for me. The things that did happen were generally quite predictable, and I think that's because of the way the author writes. Now, the author doesn't write badly, like, do not get me wrong, she's a good writer, but she has the tendency to do this thing which I personally hate, and it is to tell you things rather than show you things. Like, I feel like the best example is the fact that characters would do things like, look, isn't he creepy? Rather than it being kind of shown, which I guess takes a little bit longer, and I guess would have made the book longer, but I wouldn't have minded. I think it was a really interesting story, so I think I would have really enjoyed if it had a little bit extra text and was drawn out a little bit, and there was a bit more suspense, and things just didn't happen quite as snappily. But then at the same time, if you're looking for quite a quick, fast-paced mystery, then it is probably the book for you. The writing style just wasn't my cup of tea, if that makes sense. But I would still recommend it if you think it sounds interesting. Sometimes that is just an unfortunate side effect of overhype. But I will be checking out more books by Alice Thompson, because I think she's got a really interesting imagination. I swear we're almost done. The next book is a non-fiction book that I filmed a really long discussion of, so I won't say much about here, but it was the first book for the Feminist Orchestra book club, and that is I Call Myself a Feminist, The View from 25 Women Under 30, which is, as the title implies, it's 25 testimonies from different women explaining why they themselves call themselves a feminist. It's a real selection. There's some really powerful testimonies in there. There's some that didn't blow me away. One of the interesting things I did find during the discussion is that testimonies I didn't particularly get on with, others really did, and ones that others really didn't, I really did. The same thing amongst different people. The other thing is that there's a large scattering of different feminist quotes in there, some of which again really powerful, others a little bit pointless, so I think it could have been trimmed down a little bit in that respect. However, I noticed a lot of people loved the quotes and other people were like, wished the quotes weren't there, and I think that's just the nature of the book. And I also think because it is an introduction to feminism, it's not going to blow everybody away. It's not got something new to offer everybody, but I found it a very positive and a very inspirational read, so I personally am really glad I read it. And I think if you're looking to learn a little bit more about feminism, the word feminism and modern feminism, then I think it's definitely worth checking out. The last two things I read, however, I don't have much to say about, and that's because they're individual issues of comics, and those are issues 33 and 34 of Saga. Generally speaking, I really enjoyed them. I'm really enjoying Saga. I think different issues have different levels of action. Sometimes not much happens, sometimes quite a lot happens, but because I've started reading them as individual issues, it's kind of hard to rate them individually because they are part of a whole. All I can say is that I'm enjoying it, so I'm still really enjoying it, and I'm going to keep downloading the individual issues because I quite like to see what happens as soon as I can. It's one of those graphic novels I am quite eager to see how things turn out, so rather than waiting for the volumes now, I'm enjoying downloading the issues. But those are all the things I had to talk to you about in this video. Epically long, I don't know how I'm going to edit it, but like I said, there's a couple of reviews already up on my channel for some of these books that I'll link down below, and I'm definitely planning on reviewing some of these other books in other videos, so look out for those if you're hoping to hear more about any of these books. But until next time guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!